Welcome to my transparent watercolor tutorial, Bowl of Foliage. This is a narrated step-by-step tutorial at normal speed. Recently, I released a video with an exercise to create various color schemes randomly. This is an example of one of those color scheme sheets, and I'm going to pick one to use for this composition. This is the color scheme I've chosen to use for this painting. It's a combination of ultramarine blue, cobalt violet, cobalt turquoise, and sap green. I'm beginning this painting with a very simple sketch. I've started by drawing a very simple outline of a bowl shape and some of the leaves that are going to be in various areas of the composition. And it doesn't have a lot of detail of anything. I've applied a very loose light valued wash that wasn't captured by the camera. It contains the colors that were in my color scheme sample: ultramarine blue, cobalt violet, cobalt turquoise, and sap green. One of the interesting things about using cobalt violet is it's a very granular color, and when you use it in a wash, it gives a lot of nice granulation that leaves a nice texture in your wash. As I begin to work on this painting, one of the things I'll point out is this is a smaller painting. It's on a piece of paper which is 8 by 10 inches. So it's a nice size to do a small to medium painting on. It's one of my standard sizes that I work on, and it fits nicely in a mat for an 11 by 14 inch frame. I've started to do some work here with sap green, and what I'm doing is actually, although the brushwork is fairly small, my objective right here is to try and define some of the larger shapes. So on the right side, what I've done is start to define some of the negative space between the foliage that is on the edge of this bowl, and by doing that I've started to define the larger shape of the bowl. And now I'm going to the other side, I'm doing a similar thing. So I'm starting to paint negative space on the edge of the bowl, and by doing that I'm starting to define that larger shape. So next I'm going to continue with some of this same type of brushwork, and instead of defining the bowl, I'm going to go around the perimeter of the leaf shapes here, the foliage, which is going to start to define the larger shape that is the mass of the foliage and kind of a floral feeling in the middle of this that I have. So I'm working around the perimeter again in negative space, but I'm also painting some shapes right there, like to suggest a leaf shape there behind the foliage. But in doing this, I'm working around these larger shapes and starting to define those by doing brushwork along the edge of those, what would be those larger shapes. There's times when you can't think of each component, each little element in your composition as a single entity. You have to look at how they relate to one another. And while all these leaf shapes are individual leaves or pieces of foliage, together they form a larger shape or larger mass, and you have to design with that in mind. It's just like when you're working in a landscape and you're painting a wooded area. While you paint the individual trees, there's a point where you have to treat it as the woods, and there's layers of trees as you go back in the distance, and each assemblage of those trees, each grouping of those trees forms its own shape. So it's the same thing. You don't just think of the tree, you think of the woods. And in this composition, you don't just think of each individual leaf, you think of the assemblage of the leaves and the shapes that they make overall. I like to put down a value on an edge, and then I use my spray bottle and spray away from that edge, and it diffuses the color away. I find it helps me create direction in a painting. It gives this nice gradation as it diffuses the color, and you have to watch your timing on when you do it, and And after you've done it a few times, you have to dry the paper before you start putting brush marks down again, because you'll lose your edge, because you're basically starting to paint wet into wet at that point. So the way I do this, I start with a wet on dry mark, and then I take my fine mist spray and I spray it the direction that I want, and often trying to spray away from an edge. One of the things I want to touch on as I continue to work on this painting is, as you're watching this video, don't focus so much on the painting and trying to recreate the painting I'm doing. Think more about the process and the process that I'm going through to create this painting. So I started with a very basic sketch, some very simple shapes, a bowl shape, some leaf shapes. They're all very simple. They're not very complex. I'm not using a photograph. I'm making shapes, but you could use a photograph and take the same approach, and I do sometimes. But so I have my sketch, and then I have a color scheme that I'm going to use that I took from an exercise I did, right? So I have a sample sheet of random color schemes, and I selected one of those. So with my sketch and my color scheme, I start to develop this painting, starting to define large shapes, starting to build my values, and there's an initial wash on my over my drawing that is kind of my color roadmap as this painting evolves. As I mentioned, you can use this same approach whether you're using a photographic reference or not. When you're painting a photo from a photographic reference, you as the artist interpret how you're going to represent that. And the approach can be the same in terms of this process, where you may pick a color scheme, or you may just use local color, but you're going to not necessarily include every little detail in your painting, and you're going to have some areas that are greater areas of focus than others, but you're also going to be defining shapes, large shapes, small shapes. You're going to have color accents throughout your painting, but this same process, the same mentality and how you approach your painting, it doesn't have to change because you're using a photograph for reference. So you still start with a sketch, and you may or may not have some type of a color scheme, but you are going to choose a color dominance probably as you're going in to do the painting, and you're going to start to define shapes, you're going to start to build values, and little by little you're going to develop your painting. And it's a similar process to what I'm doing here, even though I don't have a photo for reference. So at this point in my painting, I'm continuing to put down some darker values and build my values and start to develop shapes in my composition, some of the smaller shapes and some of the areas in negative space. And I'm using cobalt turquoise right now. I'm working with some ultramarine blue to define some darker valued areas. And as you look at my composition, you can see that I'm using ultramarine blue, it's not at all going to be a dominant color in my composition. It's overall it's a cool composition, really, when the turquoise and the purple and the blue, but it's got the sap green accent, which is more of a warm green, so it brings a little warmth to the composition. But overall, this is a fairly cool painting in terms of temperature. So I look for areas to take this dark value that kind of give a suggestion of a shape, like a linear shape going behind a leaf shape. It helps build some depth into my painting. I'm always looking for overlap. What shape overlaps something, and what other shape is created in between it. Now, I know I say shapes a lot, but that's just how I think. So some of this is negative space, some of it becomes positive space. But here I'm going to start to use a darker value on the left side of this bowl shape to start to define that edge a little stronger. I think that as you start to develop more as an artist and you start thinking more in terms of design elements and principles, you look less at objects as objects in terms of a leaf or a door or a window or a shovel. You think less about them as the object, and you think more of them in terms of it's a square shape, it's a large shape, it's a small shape, it's got texture, it has a hard edge, it has a soft edge, it's a warm color, it's a cool color. You start thinking about those types of things and become less concerned with the subject. I mean, it's not that there's not an awareness of what you're painting or trying to paint. If you're going to paint a landscape in a wooded area and you have a certain way you want to represent that or interpret what you're looking at, in the end you're going to do it by creating textures and edges and shapes, and there's going to be different sizes involved, and there's going to be dominant areas, there's going to be areas that are very busy and areas to rest. And those are the things that you start thinking about when you start to tune more into design and less about trying to paint a picture of what I'm looking at. Or maybe better said, trying to copy what I'm looking at, especially when using a photograph. Sometimes as I'm building up my layers, I become aware that everything's kind of flat. Although I'm getting some depth in terms of large shapes, they all kind of seem to be on the same plane. So what I'm doing right now is I'm taking this ultramarine blue and I'm starting to build a layer there that's to the outside of the edge of the shape of the flowers and foliage and suggests background. And I'm using this ultramarine blue tone as a wash over top a number of these areas to kind of set that apart from the flowers and foliage and send it back a little bit. And I'm going to take that blue tone here on the other side just to give the suggestion that that blue tone is following all along the background behind this bowl of flowers and foliage, and it helps visually connect that, make that connection with the corner on the top left. And I've taken a little bit of that value down to the left here too, but I'm just trying to give the illusion that there's a dark shape behind what's going on here, and it starts to send the bowl forward and set the background back a little bit farther. And then on top of this, I'm building a darker value with a very purple tone. I've actually gone to my palette and got some, and I've started using mauve, which is a very deep violet. It's actually a pretty true secondary color, and a real strong color that you can't mix otherwise. And it's a nice color of mauve. So it gives me a nice dark value to give me even a little bit more depth in that ultramarine blue field. Here I'm going to put some darker green marks here to help better define some of these leaves that are kind of hanging over and behind the bowl. And I'm going to soften that up a little bit and get that nice gradation. I really like that effect I get when I'll put a dark tone on, such as this, and then use this fine mist spray, and it really diffuses that color over the area in the direction you're spraying, and it just gives a nice effect. It's a glazing effect, but it's a diffused glazing effect. Now I'm going to take a middle value purple tone here, and I'm just going to put a few brush marks just to give the indication of where the edges are coming together from the vase and then the surface it's sitting on. And I'm not going to take that all the way across. There's a pencil mark there which I'm eventually going to erase, and I'm going to let that be a lost edge. I'm going to expand this blue glaze a little bit more and claim a little larger area for background. You can see once I glaze over it with that blue tone, it starts to unify with the area that I've already covered, and it just expands the size of that shape. So now with that blue glaze, what I have is a background area that's tied together with that blue tone, and then I have the foliage and the flower starting to come more forward more and more pronounced. So as I do this and I build some depth as I put my little marks and little brush marks throughout the painting with darker values that suggest that it's a pocket of space that you can look back into. It gets very spotty but stays flat until I really start to take down some larger areas to suggest that it's in the background. I also want to take some of that blue tone and work it more into the middle of the composition. So I'm going to take that, and as I work around some of the perimeter still, my thoughts right now are leaning towards moving that blue tone into some other areas so that it makes a better connection with the overall composition. It doesn't have to be much, it's just a few smaller shapes that I'm painting. Here I'm going to use a flat brush that's been dipped in water and with the excess taken off. It's just a damp brush, and do some lifting. I like to make these linear marks that give this kind of a wispy feel to what's going on and brings a level of activity to my painting. And certain colors lift easier than others. This cobalt violet lifts fairly easily, and you can see I drag my brush through the pigment, through the darker value and onto a lighter value, and the result I get is a light area over the dark shape, and then a darker area over the lighter shape from dragging that pigment on to the surface of it. Some pigments you'll have more success than others. This dark mauve color works pretty well. You can lift it off and then you drag a nice middle value onto the lighter area. But it brings some motion and a level of activity to the painting that I like. And sometimes it doesn't lift off that much, and I'll come in with a light wash on either side of that mark and make it a little bit more pronounced by glazing on along the edges of that mark and making a little darker value beside it. I'm at a point in my painting where I'm just trying to put some finishing touches on. I'm taking some middle to dark values and I'm going around my painting, trying to clean some areas up, trying to give a little bit more detail in some areas, and it takes a little bit of time, but just some finishing touches to make it a bit more polished and complete. I think one of the questions that's asked most frequently is, how do I know when to stop on my painting? And that can be a tough question. For myself, I have a process that I follow where I start with my large shapes. I work down to my smaller shapes, and I start with my lighter values and work with darker values as I go, and start putting in more and more detail as I go. So by design, I have a process that I work my way towards. And when I reach a point where I've described my larger shapes and I have the whole value range there, and I've got a level of detail, and I've brought forth a center of interest, I'm pretty much getting to a point by design that I'm ready to stop. I know that. And right now, I could stop on this painting, And the brush marks that I'm putting are just to add a level of crispness and make it a little bit more polished. But when you reach a point where the brush marks you're making are no longer adding value, then it's time to stop. There's no reason to keep making brush marks that make no sense and don't bring value to your painting. And what exactly do I mean by bringing value to your painting? When you put down a brush mark, you're doing it for a reason, or should be. You're trying to describe something. You're trying to define an edge. You're trying to add color. You're trying to put a wash down because you want to unify an area. There's reasons for doing the things we do in a painting. I'm putting some brush marks here because I want a crisper feel in some areas. I want to polish it a little bit. There's areas where I still want to have a little bit more activity with some of these linear shapes. And there's a reason that I'm making these marks. But if I get to a point where I don't have a clue on why I'm doing this, and I'm just doing it because I think I'm not done and I should still be moving my paintbrush, then I've reached a point where I need to just stop, take a break. If I can't figure it out, set it aside for a few days and come back. And when you come back to it, something might hit you and you say, I know what I need to do this, and you'll have a reason for continuing. On the other hand, you might look at it and say, I think it's done, but don't wander aimlessly just painting to paint because you don't have a clue where you're at. Your chances of success are very slim. At this point, I'm taking a small liner brush and with a mid to dark value tone, and I'm just going to make some of these linear kind of grassy marks that I like to make. So I just drag him. That's a green value right there. And as I do that, you can see I lift my brush at times and then put it back down and continue. I just give an interruption to the line at times to give the suggestion that it's going underneath something. And other times I let it go without interruption. But you can see right there how I just picked it up and made my brush stroke continue about an inch further down. It just makes it feel like there's something going over top of it. And that's one of the techniques I use to try and build value or depth into my compositions, is by creating situations of overlap. See there, I pick my brush up, a little dash, and again, it looks like it starts, stops, so there's something interrupting it. So that's my painting. As I mentioned, it's done on an 8x10 sheet of watercolor paper, which is a standard size I work on, and it fits well in a 11x14 mat. And I use acid-free single white mats, and the smaller sizes I buy pre-cut. The larger size for a half sheet or a full sheet watercolor I cut myself. But it fits nicely on this size painting, and with the masking tape around the edge to hold it to my board as I paint, and it gives a good result in terms of the image size is just enough to fit to the edges of this mat and not show where it was taped. And again, it's easy for me because I can keep my paper stocked at a standard size. I can keep my mat stocked at a standard size, and then I don't even have to think about it. I stick with fairly simple framing, and because it is a standard size frame, when somebody purchases one of my paintings in a mat, it's very easy for them to buy a frame at a reasonable price and frame it themselves and avoid the high cost of having it done at a framing center. I hope you enjoyed this, and as I said earlier, think less about the painting I did and more about the process I used to create the painting. Are there elements in this process that you can adopt and take into your process to help make improvements in how you approach your painting? If you have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page on my website, rsurowiczart.com, where I try and keep it updated with the latest information. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowiczart@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like it, share it, and comment. Thanks for watching.